Have you ever wondered why Japan's most powerful billionaires built their empires in China? For 30 years, global playbook is predictable. If you were a Japanese manufacturing giant, you built in China. That was a formula. China was a destination for billion-dollar factories. In this video, I'm going to tell you why. But before then, what if I told you that these men, the titans of Japanese industry, made a collective bet that China will be the foundation of their wealth forever? But in 2022, something changed. Not because of politics, not because of war, but because one Japanese billionaire made an observation that everyone else was too comfortable to see. And that observation triggered the largest industrial migration in modern history. What if I told you that Japanese factories worth over $847 billion, factories employing 2.3 million Chinese workers, would begin shutting down, that thousands of container ships would stop sailing to Shanghai but moving to another city, not Europe, not America, but Philippines. Yes, the same Philippine known for its warm family, deep faith, and resilient people. Before we fully understand why, we need to visit someone whose story sits in the center of this conversation. Takeshi Yamamoto was 73 years old in 2022. Born in 1949 in Osaka, Japan, he was the son of a textile factory owner who had survived the post-World War II economic devastation and rebuilt his family's manufacturing business from nothing. Takeshi inherited not just his father's company, but his father's philosophy that Japan's future depended on finding the most efficient, most cost-effective places to manufacture goods. In 1992, when Takeshi was 43 years old, China was opening its doors to foreign investment. The country had just begun its transformation from an isolated communist state to a manufacturing powerhouse. Takeshi saw the opportunity immediately. While other Japanese manufacturers were cautious, Takeshi moved decisively. He established his first factory in Shanghai in 1993. Electronics manufacturing, semiconductors, integrated circuits, components that would power computers and phones worldwide. The factory was brilliant. The cost was 60% lower than manufacturing in Japan. The Chinese government offered tax incentives. Labor was plentiful and inexpensive. Within 5 years, Takeshi's Shanghai operation employed 12,000 workers and was generating $340 million in annual revenue. Over the next 30 years, Takeshi expanded aggressively. By 2022, Yamamoto Electronics operated 78 factories across China. These factories employed 2.3 million workers directly and another 4.8 million workers indirectly through supply chains. The factories generated $67 billion in annual revenue. Takeshi Yamamoto, worth $18.6 billion, had become one of the richest men in the world, and his wealth was built on China. But in 2022, something made him question everything. In January 2022, Takeshi made his 340th visit to China. He was now 73 years old. His body was showing the wear of decades of work. His physician had advised him to slow down, to retire, to enjoy his grandchildren. But Takeshi could not stop working. Work was his identity. The company was his legacy. He traveled to Shanghai for a quarterly board meeting with his operations team. The factory was running smoothly. Production was up. Efficiency metrics were good. Everything appeared to be perfect. But as Takeshi walked through the factory floor, something he did at every visit, physically inspecting the work, he noticed something subtle. The workers looked less happy than they had in previous visits. The turnover notices posted in the break room showed that 34% of workers had left in the past year. The workers who remained appeared fatigued, stressed, less engaged. During his meeting with the factory manager, Takeshi asked directly, "Why is turnover so high?" The manager, a man named Wei Chen who had worked with Takeshi for 22 years, answered honestly, "Mr. Yamamoto, wages in China have increased 340% since 1993. A factory worker in Shanghai now earns $890 per month. That is not cheap labor anymore. Young Chinese workers are moving to cities. They are starting their own businesses. They are not interested in factory work. We are now competing with higher wages, longer hours, and increasingly difficult working conditions to keep workers." That conversation planted a seed in Takeshi's mind. If labor costs were rising, If workers were becoming harder to find, if China was no longer the cost advantage it had been, then why was his entire empire built there? But he was about to discover something even more disturbing. Takeshi returned to Tokyo and commissioned a comprehensive analysis. He hired economic consultants to study the real cost of manufacturing in China in 2022 versus 1993. What they discovered was shocking. While nominal labor costs had increased 340%, the total cost of manufacturing had increased even more dramatically due to regulatory changes, environmental compliance costs, intellectual property protection requirements, and supply chain complexity. Additionally, the geopolitical environment had fundamentally shifted. The United States had imposed tariffs on Chinese products. Trade relationships were becoming unstable. The cost of shipping, which had been $450 per container in 2020, had surged to $2,100 per container by early 2022. These costs were eating into profit margins. More concerning, Takeshi's consultants identified something he had not fully appreciated: supply chain vulnerability. 78% of Yamamoto Electronics production occurred in China. If a crisis occurred, a pandemic, a natural disaster, a geopolitical conflict, the company's entire manufacturing capability could be compromised in days. The consultant presented Takeshi with a stark analysis. Your company is not as profitable as it appears. Hidden costs have eroded margins. Your supply chain is dangerously concentrated, and the geopolitical risks are increasing. We recommend immediate diversification of manufacturing to at least 2 other countries. Takeshi understood the recommendation. Intellectually, he knew it was correct, but emotionally, it was devastating. His life's work, his entire fortune, his legacy, all built on the assumption that China would be stable and cost-effective forever. The consultants had told him that assumption was wrong. But Takeshi was not ready to accept that his 30-year strategy was flawed. Takeshi commissioned another study. Where else in the world could he manufacture electronics efficiently? The consultants analyzed 4 to 3 countries: Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Mexico, India, Poland. Their recommendation came back: Vietnam would be the most obvious alternative. Labor costs were still low. Geopolitical risk was moderate. Infrastructure was developing rapidly. Takeshi's first instinct was to move his operations to Vietnam. It made perfect business sense. But something made him hesitate. He decided to visit potential alternative locations personally. In May 2022, at age 73, Takeshi boarded a plane. Not to Vietnam first, to the Philippines. He had no specific reason for this choice. Just intuition. Just a vague sense that he should look at a place nobody else was looking at. When his plane landed in Manila, the heat and humidity hit him immediately. The traffic was chaotic compared to Shanghai's organized precision. The airport was crowded with travelers. The skyline was impressive but uneven. This did not look like an industrial powerhouse. This looked like a developing nation. Everything in Takeshi's analytical mind told him he was wasting his time. But then something extraordinary happened. He met someone who would change his entire vision of the future. During a business forum in Manila, Takeshi attended a presentation about Philippine manufacturing capabilities. The presenter was a Filipina engineer named Dr. Maria Garcia, 48 years old, the founder of Philippine Advanced Manufacturing Institute. She was not a government official. She was a private sector engineer who had spent 20 years building manufacturing infrastructure in the Philippines. Her presentation was not about what the Philippines had. It was about what the Philippines could become. For decades, Dr. Garcia said, the Philippines has been seen as a service economy, a place where companies outsource customer service, where people emigrate for nursing jobs overseas. But that is not our destiny. We have young people. We have engineers. We have the ability to become a major manufacturing hub, not because we are cheap, because we are capable, eager, and hungry to build something. She showed data. Young population, 102 million people, with median age of 25.6 years. Engineering graduates, 47,000 per year from Philippine universities. English proficiency, 63% of the population speaks English fluently. Port infrastructure, 5 major ports with capacity expansion underway. Electricity, rapidly expanding renewable energy capacity. Land cost, 92% cheaper than China. Wage rates, $280 to $450 per month for skilled workers, higher than the absolute poorest nations, but lower than China, with rapidly increasing local purchasing power. But what Dr. Garcia said next made Takeshi stop thinking about numbers and start thinking about the future. Dr. Garcia concluded her presentation with a statement that haunted Takeshi. Japan built its manufacturing empire on finding places where costs were low and labor was available. That strategy worked for 50 years. But the world is changing. The Philippines is not asking to be cheap. We are asking to be partners. We are asking to build not just factories, but communities. We are asking for long-term investment, not short-term extraction. The companies that understand this, that see the Philippines not as a cheaper version of China, but as a completely different opportunity, those companies will thrive in the next 30 years. The companies that just replicate their China strategy here will fail. Because we will not accept being treated as a cost center. We are becoming a value creator. That phrase, value creator, not cost center, struck Takeshi deeply. For 30 years, he had viewed his Chinese factories as cost centers, places to minimize expense and maximize output. But Dr. Garcia was right. The world had changed. Workers in the Philippines would not accept being treated the way workers had been treated in the 1990s. Young people in the Philippines had options, education, ambition, dreams. They wanted to be part of something meaningful, not just cheap labor. Takeshi realized something profound in that moment. The future did not belong to the company that found the cheapest labor. The future belonged to the company that found the most engaged, most motivated, most capable workforce. And that workforce was in the Philippines. But he was about to face the greatest challenge of his career. Takeshi made a decision that stunned his board of directors. He would begin transferring manufacturing operations from China to the Philippines. Not slowly, aggressively. Over the next 5 years, he would close 42 of his 78 Chinese factories and establish 38 new factories in the Philippines. The investment required $23.4 billion. The disruption, massive. The risk, enormous. When Takeshi announced this decision to his board in June 2022, the reaction was hostile. Board member Hiroshi Tanaka, 7 to 9 years old, a man who had been with the company for 43 years, stood up and said, "This is madness. We have built our entire enterprise in China. Our relationships are there. Our supply chains are there. Our experience is there. The Philippines is an unknown, a risk. We should stay in China and adapt, not abandon everything." Another board member, Kenji Soto, 68 years old, said, "Our shareholders will revolt. We are talking about writing off billions in assets in China. We are talking about moving to a country with less developed infrastructure, less political stability, and less experience with electronics manufacturing. I cannot support this." The CFO, Yuki Nakamura, 61 years old, presented a financial analysis showing that the transition would depress earnings for at least 3 years. The stock would likely fall. Investors would question the strategy. The career risk for Takeshi was extreme. At 73 years old, with enormous wealth and a well-established legacy, Takeshi could have chosen to retire. Instead, he chose conflict. He had one powerful argument that changed the conversation. Takeshi stood up and looked directly at the 3 dissenting board members. "Gentlemen," he said slowly, "I have been in this business for 51 years. I have built this company from a $12 million annual revenue operation to a $67 billion annual revenue operation. I have made difficult decisions before. But this decision is not difficult because it is risky. This decision is difficult because it is necessary. And it is necessary because the world has changed, and we have not acknowledged the change." He paused. In 1993, China was an opportunity because it was low-cost and stable. Today, China is neither. Labor costs have exploded. Geopolitical risk has increased. Our supply chain is dangerously concentrated. If we do not move now, we will be forced to move in a crisis 5 years from now when conditions are worse and options are limited. The Philippines is not a perfect solution, but it is the right solution for the next 30 years. He continued, "I am 73 years old. I could retire tomorrow and enjoy my wealth. Instead, I am choosing to invest $23.4 billion to transform this company for the future. I am doing this not because I am confident it will succeed. I am doing this because I am certain that if we do not move, we will decline. And I refuse to be the leader who presided over the decline of Yamamoto Electronics. The board voted. The vote was 9-3 in favor of Takeshi's plan. The 3 dissenters abstained from further discussion, but did not resign. The decision was made. The great industrial migration was about to begin, but the real challenge was just starting. In August 2022, the first Yamamoto Electronics factory broke ground in Clark Freeport Zone, 60 kilometers north of Manila. The facility would be massive, 285,000 square meters of manufacturing space. Designed to employ 12,000 workers initially, with capacity to expand to 24,000. The cost? $2.8 billion. Over the next 18 months, Takeshi authorized the construction of 13 additional factories across the Philippines. Locations in Laguna, Cavite, Subic, Cagayan de Oro. Each factory would be state-of-the-art. Each factory would incorporate the lessons learned from 30 years in China, but redesigned for 21st century manufacturing. Automation would be advanced, reducing labor dependency but creating higher-skilled jobs. Supply chains would be diversified, not relying on any single source. Worker conditions would be world-class, with training, development, and career pathways. The investment pace was extraordinary. Yamamoto Electronics was spending $1.6 billion per month on Philippines expansion. At the same time, Takeshi authorized the closure of Chinese factories. By December 2022, 12 factories had closed. By June 2023, 28 factories had closed. By December 2023, 42 factories had closed. The Chinese government was furious. They tried to impose restrictions. They threatened regulatory obstacles. But Takeshi was resolute. The factories were being closed. The workers were being offered severance, far above legal requirements. The equipment was being sold or relocated. The empire in China was being dismantled. And something extraordinary began happening in the Philippines. As Yamamoto factories opened in the Philippines, something profound occurred. Young Filipinos who had previously emigrated, nurses working in the Middle East, engineers working in Singapore, skilled workers working anywhere but home, began returning. Why leave the Philippines when world-class manufacturing jobs were available at home? Universities in the Philippines saw enrollment in engineering programs increase by 187%. Real estate prices in Clark and Laguna tripled as workers moved to be near the factories. Suppliers began establishing operations to support Yamamoto. Philippine companies saw opportunities to become part of global supply chains. The economic impact was staggering. In 2022, Philippines' GDP was $472 billion. By 2025, it had grown to $587 billion, directly because of Japanese manufacturing relocation. Unemployment fell from 5.2% to 2.8%. Average wages increased from $12,000 annually to $18,400 annually. Poverty rates declined. More importantly, the narrative about the Philippines began changing globally. The country was no longer just an outsourcing destination for services. It was becoming a manufacturing hub, a place where serious technology companies were investing billions, a place with ambition and capability. But the story gets more interesting. Takeshi Yamamoto's decision to leave China triggered a cascade of decisions throughout Japanese industry. If Yamamoto Electronics could move to the Philippines successfully, perhaps others should consider it too. By 2024, 53 Japanese manufacturing companies had announced plans to relocate operations from China to the Philippines, Vietnam, or Indonesia. The total announced investment, $437 billion. Japanese politicians who had been focused on bringing manufacturing back to Japan realized something. The Philippines offered a middle ground. Not as expensive as Japan. Not as risky as China. Not as underdeveloped as some other Southeast Asian nations. The Philippine government, seeing the opportunity, began making dramatic policy changes. Port regulations were streamlined. Tax incentives were offered. Infrastructure development was accelerated. Universities received funding to develop manufacturing-focused curricula. The transformation was happening at multiple levels simultaneously: corporate, governmental, educational, and cultural. The Philippines was not just receiving foreign investment. The The Philippines was being transformed by it. But for Takeshi personally, the most meaningful transformation was something different. By 2024, Yamamoto Electronics had successfully transferred 62% of its manufacturing capacity from China to Philippines. Chinese factory closures have been completed for 41 of 42 factories. The last one will close in early 2025. The Philippines now accounted for 68% of Yamamoto's global manufacturing. The company's stock price, which had fallen 18% when the announcement was made in 2022, had rebounded and reached an all-time high of $127 per share by the end of 2024. The transition that analysts predicted would depress earnings for 3 years had actually increased earnings because the Philippines' operational efficiency, combined with slightly lower transportation costs and emerging supply chain advantages, had improved margins. Takeshi's gamble had worked financially, but more importantly, it had worked philosophically. He had transformed his company from one that was extracting value from a low-cost location to one that was creating shared value with a developing economy. In an interview in late 2024, at age 75, Takeshi reflected on the decision. "I spent 30 years building an empire in China based on a single idea: find the cheapest place to manufacture. That idea made me billions of dollars. But it was incomplete. It was based on the assumption that we could extract value without creating community. The Philippines has taught me something different. When you invest in people, when you build infrastructure, when you create pathways for development, you do not just solve a business problem. You change lives. My Chinese factories were efficient, but they were not sustainable. Not economically, not socially, not environmentally. The Philippines operation is different. It is harder to build. It requires more investment in training, in infrastructure, in community relationships, but it is sustainable, and that matters more to me now than profit margins." But the most important chapter was still unfolding. By 2025, the Philippines had received $647 billion in Japanese manufacturing investment. This represented the largest industrial migration in modern history. 40% of Japanese manufacturing capacity that had been in China in 2022 was now in the Philippines or other Southeast Asian nations. Chinese factories that had operated for decades were being dismantled. The Chinese government was furious, but largely powerless to stop it. The economics were too powerful. The geopolitical risks were too high. The future was pointing toward diversification away from China. The broader implication was geopolitical. For 30 years, the world supply chains had been concentrated in China. This concentration had created enormous economic interdependence that had been viewed as stabilizing, but it had also created vulnerability. If China experienced a crisis, political, environmental, or pandemic, the entire global supply chain would collapse. The diversification away from China, accelerated by Takeshi's decision, addressed this vulnerability. The Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, these nations became secondary manufacturing hubs. The global economy became more resilient, and the balance of power in Asia began shifting. Investment flowing to the Philippines created economic opportunity that reduced China's regional dominance. It was not war. It was not conflict. It was simply the natural consequence of economic actors making rational decisions based on risk and opportunity. What would Takeshi's legacy ultimately be? In 2026, at age 77, Takeshi announced that he would be stepping down as CEO of Yamamoto Electronics, though remaining as chairman. His successor, Emi Yamamoto, his granddaughter, age 38, educated at Stanford and MIT, would lead the company into its next phase. Before stepping down, Takeshi wrote a letter to be published alongside the announcement. In that letter, he reflected on his journey. 53 years ago, I took over a company worth $12 million. Today, it is worth $637 billion. That growth came from finding opportunities that others overlooked. In 1993, when most Japanese manufacturers were skeptical of China, I moved decisively. That decision created enormous wealth, but it also created enormous vulnerability. In 2022, when I realized that the vulnerabilities had become critical, I made another decision. This one was harder because it required admitting that the strategy that had made me successful was no longer viable. The Philippines decision will define the next chapter of this company. Not because it will make us wealthier, though it likely will, but because it represents a maturation of how we think about manufacturing, about communities, about our responsibility as a global company. I am proud of what we built in China. I am equally proud of what we are building in the Philippines. My hope is that the leaders who come after me will continue this principle, that the best business decisions are not just profitable. They are sustainable. They are responsible. They create shared value. But the story did not end with Takeshi's retirement. By 2030, the Philippines had become the third largest manufacturing economy in Asia after Japan and South Korea. The nation that had been known for exporting overseas workers was now exporting manufactured goods worth $234 billion annually. Young Filipinos who had left the country were returning. Brain drain had become brain gain. Universities were producing world-class engineers. The nation's poverty rate had fallen from 21.6% to 12.4%. Infrastructure had been dramatically upgraded. The GDP per capita had increased from $3,299 in 2022 to $6,847 in 2030. The transformation was not just economic. It was psychological. Filipinos began seeing their country differently, not as a place to escape from, but as a place with potential. The geopolitical implications were equally significant. The diversification of manufacturing away from China reduced the economic dependence on China, which had implications for regional security. The Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia became economically more stable and strategically more important to Japan, the United States, and other regional powers. Investment in the Philippines created a counterbalance to Chinese regional dominance. Takeshi Yamamoto's business decision had geopolitical consequences that neither he nor the governments fully anticipated. But they were real, they were profound, and they would shape the region for decades. What would be the ultimate measure of success? In 2028, Takeshi made a final visit to China. The last Yamamoto factory had closed in 2025, but he wanted to see what remained of the empire he had spent 30 years building. Shanghai had not fallen into despair. Chinese companies had taken over the shuttered factories. Employment had been redirected. Life had continued. But something fundamental had changed. The era of explosive growth driven by foreign manufacturing investment was over. Chinese manufacturing was now competing with the Philippines, Vietnam, and other nations on quality and innovation, not cost. Wages in China had continued rising. Young Chinese workers were moving to better-paid service sector jobs. The manufacturing boom that had defined the 2000s and 2010s was contracting. Takeshi walked through the industrial parks of Shanghai where his factories had operated. The facilities were maintained, but they were not his anymore. He felt a mixture of emotions, pride in what he had built, recognition that the era had ended, and peace with the decision to move forward. In an interview conducted during this visit, Takeshi said, "I do not regret building in China. That investment created enormous value, not just for my company, but for millions of Chinese workers who built better lives. But I am grateful I made the decision to leave when I did, because I could see the future, and the future was not in repeating the past. The future was in building something new, and that something new is in the Philippines." But the most powerful legacy was still unfolding. What Takeshi Yamamoto's decision ultimately accomplished was not just economic. It was philosophical. It challenged the assumption that the future belonged to the place that could offer the lowest costs. It demonstrated that the future belonged to the place that could offer the most capability, the most stability, and the most shared vision of development. Japanese companies that followed Takeshi's lead to the Philippines were not motivated purely by profit. They were motivated by the realization that sustainable manufacturing required sustainable communities. That long-term success required investing in people, infrastructure, and local development. The Philippines, in turn, realized something different, that the nation's future did not depend on its people leaving. It depended on creating conditions where capable people would want to stay. Universities increased engineering education. Governments improved infrastructure. Communities invested in their futures. The transformation was not imposed by Japanese investment. It was catalyzed by it. The Philippines' own agency was what made the transformation real and lasting. What would the final chapter reveal? In his final years, Takeshi Yamamoto became a voice for a different kind of business philosophy. He gave speeches at universities. He wrote articles. He counseled younger business leaders. The core of his message was simple. The era of extractive economics is ending. The era of creative economics is beginning. Extractive economics asks, what can I take from this place? Creative economics asks, what can we build together? That shift in thinking, that fundamental change in how we approach business, is the most important challenge facing your generation of leaders. Because the companies that figure out how to create shared value will thrive. The companies that continue extracting will eventually find nothing left to extract. Takeshi passed away in 2031 at age 82. His legacy was not just financial, it was philosophical. He had demonstrated that a billionaire could make decisions driven not just by greed, but by wisdom. That a businessman could recognize when the strategies that made him successful had become obsolete. That an industrialist could invest in communities while building wealth. These were not revolutionary ideas, but in the world of business, they were uncommon enough to be remarkable. Takeshi Yamamoto had become a symbol of a different possibility. A possibility where success and responsibility could coexist. Where profit and purpose could align. Where the future could be built not by extracting from the weak, but by investing in the capable. What remained after he was gone? By 2035, the Philippines had become the beating heart of Japanese manufacturing in Asia. Yamamoto Electronics, now led by EMI Yamamoto, had factories throughout the archipelago employing 267,000 workers. The company's annual revenue had surpassed $120 billion. Other Japanese companies had similarly invested. The total Japanese manufacturing investment in the Philippines had exceeded $1.2 trillion. The Philippines' GDP had grown to $847 billion. The nation had transformed from a developing country with significant poverty to an upper-middle-income nation with thriving cities, world-class infrastructure, and genuine economic opportunity. Young Filipinos attended universities, received training, entered careers in advanced manufacturing, and built successful lives at home. The brain drain had reversed. The nation had acquired dignity. The transformation that had begun with Takeshi Yamamoto's decision in 2022 had rippled across decades and transformed the nation. He did not do this alone. The Philippine government did the work. The Filipino people did the work. But Takeshi Yamamoto had seen the possibility when others could not see it. He had taken the risk when others would not take it. He had invested the capital when others were uncertain. And in doing so, he had changed the trajectory of nations. The final measure of legacy. In 2033, the Philippine government commissioned a monument in Clark Freeport Zone. It was not a statue of Takeshi Yamamoto. That would have been inappropriate. Instead, it was a monument to the workers. A massive sculpture representing the hands of workers, Filipino and Japanese, building together. The inscription read, "In recognition of the partnership between Japan and the Philippines, in honor of the workers who built the future, in memory of the vision that brought us here." Takeshi Yamamoto never saw the monument. He had passed away 2 years before its completion. But his granddaughter, CEO EMI Yamamoto, attended its dedication. Standing before the sculpture of those joined hands, she reflected on her grandfather's journey. He had built an empire on the assumption that success meant finding cheaper places to manufacture. By the end of his life, he had learned something deeper, that true success meant building sustainable value. That legacy meant more than wealth. It meant transformation. It meant possibility. It meant showing that a different way was possible. The monument stood in the heart of the Philippines manufacturing zone, a permanent reminder that the future belongs not to those who exploit, but to those who invest. Not to those who extract, but to those who create. Not to those who see people as costs, but to those who see people as partners in building the future.